Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for this fourth and final session of A Journey Through Black History Month with Dr. Jeremiah Piercy. My name is Cyrus Worrells, and I'm Director of Programs with the Institute for Spirituality and Health. And to everyone who's joined us during this series, whether this is you're just joining us or you've joined us for all four, thank you very much for being a part of this community, and we encourage you to stay with us and connect with us in all that we do. And you can learn more about what we do at spiritualityandhealth.org. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Piercy, whom you've become familiar with and who brings such a unique experiential offering to Black History Month, coming from all of his experience as a veteran, as a doctor of cognitive psychology, working with diversity of communities and individuals, helping them connect with themselves and find ways to reduce their stress response and live meaningful lives. So grateful to you, Dr. Piercy, for what you've offered us, what you offer to people. And with that, I'll turn it over to you for this final session. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Cyrus. And thank you, everyone, for joining us again. I appreciate the support, and it's been my pleasure to be able to do this through the Institute for Spirituality and Health. So if you like things like this, I highly encourage you to check out their website and see what else they're offering. They offer a lot of different meditations and different classes that focus on spirituality and health. So just give them a look, and perhaps you'll find something else that would be of interest to you. So, so my goal for this week is to really tie in everything from the previous weeks, but to really showcase what it's like to be Black in America today. As many of you know, the civil rights movement in 2020 was a powerful civil rights movement that took the country by storm, with protests happening, not just in major cities in the United States, but major cities across the world, even, with places like London and Paris joining the US in this. So to build the framework for how we got there, I'm going to do what most academicians can do through statistics, but to many people, statistics are just a way to express this, but it's not really a way to live it or understand it. So I'm going to attempt at really turning these numbers that many of us know or maybe have heard at some point in time and turn them into an experience. And so we'll start with a couple of quotes, and then we'll do a relaxation, get everybody nice and comfortable, and we'll continue from there. First, it seems like God don't see fit to give the Black man nothing but dreams, but he did give us children to make them dreams seem worthwhile. Lorraine Hansberry. Many and most moments go by with us hardly aware of their passage, but love and hate and fear cause time to snag you, to drag you down like a spider's web holding fast to a doomed fly's wing. And when you're caught like that, you're aware of every moment and movement and nuance. Walter Mosley. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. One ever feels this twonness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps us from being torn asunder. W.E.B. Du Bois. And lastly, the struggle continues. After the 15th Amendment recognized the African American right to vote in 1870. Some states responded by using violent intimidation, poll taxes, and literacy tests as barriers to voting. Today, those laws have mutated into voter suppression efforts that target low-income and minority communities with disheartening effectiveness. I fight for real enfranchisement of Black people. Eric Holder, Jr. And so now you can get comfortable in your chair, on your bed, wherever you find yourself tonight. Find that relaxing spot. And as you do, close your eyes, turn out the lights, whatever you need to do to really get relaxed. Then just begin to focus on a place for you that is a place of relaxation. For many people, this may be somewhere serene and solitude. Maybe it's by a river, in a forest somewhere, and you can hear the water babbling and gurgling as it moves around the rocks, as it moves with the earth. Perhaps your place is to sit on a beach, to listen to the waves crashing into the shore. Maybe the waves even come up and touch your toes just a bit before receding back into the ocean. And maybe the sound, the smells, maybe even the breeze itself all bring that moment to a supreme relaxation. Or maybe you find yourself on the top of a mountain, looking over a vast valley, trees, maybe a river below, other mountainous peaks that tower in the distance and turn to haze as the distance grows greater. Now, I don't know exactly where you'll find yourself. And for everybody here, there's probably their own place of solitude that they would like to go. So just begin to feel yourself there. Feel your feet in the sand. Feel the wind on your face. And just listen to the water as it comes up or moves by, picturing every element of it. What would it be like to stand on the edge of the beach with the wind blowing on a warm, sunny day, feeling the sun's rays warming the skin? Or maybe you stand in the middle of a field, hearing the birds fluttering overhead, singing songs, maybe playing a game of chase. Whatever it is for you, just breathe it in for a moment. Take a deep breath, and as you do, focus on this one thing that's so relaxing to you. Breathe in deeply, and as you exhale, just let out all of the tension of the week, of the day, maybe even the past few weeks. And maybe even another deep breath to encourage the focus on this relaxation. Breathing in deep, holding it for a moment at the top. And as you exhale, just feel all the muscles relaxing, letting all the muscles turn soft, feeling the muscles in the arms relax, the muscles in the chest and back, the stomach and low back, just letting go, down to the hips, the thighs, feeling all the muscles turning soft and comfortable, down to the legs, the ankles and the feet, feeling the muscles give way. And then back to the head and neck, taking a moment to just really let go there, as many people carry tension in their shoulders. So just let all of that tension go, feeling the muscles relax more and more. And as you do, seeing where you are again. And this time, whatever negative energy you may have, any discomfort you may hold or carry, anything that you don't want in this moment, package it up into maybe a box to put onto the river. Maybe if you're in a field, you take it and tie it to a balloon and just let it go, rising higher and higher. And if you're on the mountaintop, maybe you can just crumple it up and throw it over the edge. And whatever that discomfort is, the further away it gets as you watch it disappear into the distance, you can just begin to feel the relaxation even more now, feeling more and more relaxed with each breath. And even though you may be feeling relaxed right now, just keep your mind alert and awake as we begin this session tonight. Much of what we've covered have been firsts after a lot of oppression. But since the 90s, there have been a lot of firsts that show progress, that highlight changes to the United States and to the cultures within. So before we get too deep into the story, to just celebrate what has been accomplished. The first Black governor was in 1990 to 1994. And the only other elected Black governor at the time that this was written was Deval Patrick of Massachusetts from 2000 to 2015. So even 100 years after African Americans gained the right to vote, you can see that representation was still fairly minimal. The first Black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was Colin Powell from 1989 to 1993. And then again, he was the first Secretary of State from 2001 to 2004. The first Black American president, nearly 250 years after the United States was founded, was in 2008 with Barack Obama, defeating John McCain in the general election as the 44th president of the United States. Also bringing with him the first Black First Lady, Michelle Obama. And then to celebrate the first US Supreme Court justice that was Black, Thurgood Marshall. From 1967 to 1991, he held a place on the court. And upon his passing, Clarence Thomas became the second African American to serve on the US Supreme Court. The first Black Ivy League president was in 2001 at Brown University. Ruth Simmons took that position. over 100 years after Brown was founded. The first Nobel Prize for Literature winner was Toni Morrison in 1993. The first golf champion was Tiger Woods in 1997, winning the Masters. The first Black Miss America was Suzette Charles in 1984. The first Black billionaire was Robert Johnson in 2001, the owner of BET, and Oprah Winfrey in 2003. Out of 360 billionaires at the time, there were 2 that were Black, with the first billionaire being John D. Rockefeller in 1916. So nearly 100 years after the first. And so these changes show how cultural ideologies and maybe even cultural stigmas have changed in subtle ways. And maybe it isn't, or maybe it doesn't need to be so overt. But there still persists many stigmas, stereotypes, and racism to this day. And so there are many ways that racism and prejudices come to power and persist. One of these ways has been gerrymandering. And so as we think about the culture of the United States, even the idea of gerrymandering may surprise you. The fact that our elected officials draw districts known to be partisan. And while it's illegal to make it on race, in many cases, race does become an issue. And this powerful method of redistricting boundaries to ensure that your party gains seats has a lot of analysis involved, because you don't want to have too much of your people in one district. You want about 55 to 60%. That way you don't waste a vote. And this is something that has been done on both sides, most recently in 2010. And since it happens every 10 years, 2020. So in drawing districts and deciding who's to be in which part of what, you have the ability to take away someone's vote to ensure that their vote doesn't count, to ensure that the outcome is in your favor. And so maybe, or maybe not, this is a practice of racial discrimination. It would be difficult to say, but as we go through these type of cultural anomalies, if you will, you can see how racism could be very apparent and be utilized with the most evil of intentions. And so, maybe on this day, you wake up sometime in the present. And as a Black person, maybe you have to make some appointments to see the doctor, to see a dentist, maybe even to see a lawyer. And so you schedule your appointments and go on about your day. You leave your house, driving perhaps to the doctor first. And as you get to the hospital, you notice that most of the staff are white, maybe even all of the staff, as only 5% of physicians are actually African American. And maybe you need somebody that understands where you come from, your culture. Maybe you need somebody that relates with you. But you won't find it there, at least not very often. And maybe you even feel kind of odd about it. Feeling odd about where you have to go to even seek healthcare. That you may be the only person in that room that's Black. And with that, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, two warring ideals in one dark body, always feeling the eyes of everyone else, and always having to look at oneself through the eyes of others. Because here at this hospital, it may be difficult for them to see through your eyes. And maybe later on in that week, you have an appointment with your mental health counselor or psychologist. And as you make the appointment or arrive, you find that only one out of the 8 people on staff there is Black. And that one person is already full. So now you have a choice to make. And while it shouldn't matter who you talk to about your problems, it really shouldn't matter where that person comes from, what religion they hold, or what race they are. But when it comes down to being understood, maybe that one person that you need for your mental health needs to be somebody that can identify with your struggles, to know what it's like to sit in the waiting room as the only Black person, what it's like to go to an event and being one of the few, or maybe even going to school, and out of a school of 2,500 kids, you may be one of 3 Black kids in the school. And what does that do to someone when everywhere you walk, you feel out of place? Or maybe not necessarily out of place. Maybe it's misunderstood. Or maybe something else entirely. But you notice it. And whatever that means for you. And then maybe you need to see a lawyer. And only 5% of lawyers are people of color. And only 3.7% of dentists. Only 7% of all teachers are Black. Whether you go to a grade school or a public school or not. And if you decide to study at a university, you can expect to see about 6% of the faculty as Black. And so everywhere you go, you notice the difference. And whatever that means for you walking through this world. For myself, it can feel kind of awkward at times. It can feel awkward because you're the person that stands out. And maybe you always stand out. Maybe like me, you even stand out in your family, being the only Black person in your entire family. Or maybe you're the only Black person at your job. And so then it becomes very apparent to you that this is just something that you're going to have to live through, that you're going to have to figure out a way around, to find other ways to acclimate to this culture. So maybe you begin to speak differently. Maybe you even change your name because your Black name has caused people to turn you down from jobs, or even not even getting interviews. Maybe you have to change your hairstyle because if you wear cornrows or if you have dreads, typical African hair, you may be kicked out of your school. You may be seen as unprofessional. Maybe you even have to change your style, the clothing you wear, the shoes. Maybe you even put on glasses just to separate you that much more from the racial stereotypes that dog your life. Doing whatever you can to not fit that stereotypical Black mold. Because you know what that means. And so this is your life, trying to acclimate to this culture that you were brought into by force. But you find a way to survive. Maybe you even find a way to be happy. But then there are other things that begin to worry you. Maybe you have kids. And now this world is so much different because you know the hardships that you've gone through. Maybe you've stood on the playground and had some kid call you a nigger. And you don't want that for your kids. You don't want them to feel that pain. But even as you do, you know this is going to be difficult. Because education in this country is difficult. Finding ways into the educational world where only 6% of all doctorates are given to people of color. But maybe you do your best raising your child. Do your best to avoid the stereotypical behavior. Maybe you spend your money to ensure they get a good education, because the schools around your house just don't seem to give people the opportunities that they were told they'd have. But kids are wild. Kids are experimental and easily influenced by peers. And maybe your kid starts to smoke marijuana. Maybe you know, or maybe you don't know. But one thing is sure, the war on drugs has hurt communities of color in some of the most significant ways in this country. Even at the very conception of the United States war on drugs, it was about race. The first anti-opium laws in the 1870s were directed at Chinese immigrants. The first anti-cocaine laws in the early 1900s were directed at Black men in the South. The first anti-marijuana laws in the Midwest and the Southwest in the early 1900s and the 1910s and 20s were directed at Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans. Hence why we don't even call it cannabis, but marijuana, to create the stigma, attach it to a culture, to a people. And you know that today, the Latino and Black communities are subject to wildly disproportionate drug enforcement and sentencing practices. And this was all wrought by President Nixon in 1971, when he declared the war on drugs. And maybe that was something that you supported, or maybe still support. There are dangers after all. But it must bother you some to know that John Ehrlichman, a top Nixon aide, would go on record and admit you want to know what this was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black. But by getting the public to associate those hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders. We could raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And Nixon would even go so far as to place marijuana in the Schedule 1, the most restrictive category of drugs, which would then make it a felony in many states for many years. And so maybe you worry about your child. What if a silly 18-year-old in college decides to experiment with marijuana, maybe even only on one night, only to be stopped by a cop, where the child then receives a felony offense? Never being able to vote again, never truly being an American citizen ever again. And what does that do to a community? We use other drugs fairly loosely, such as alcohol and tobacco. We know the dangers there. They're well documented. From addiction to how they affect your body, giving you cancer and destroying your liver. And so maybe you're even surprised or worried about what may come. Worried for your kids, maybe worried for your family. And in 2020, several studies found that 33% of all Black men in the United States have a felony conviction. 1 in 3 Black men in this country have been in prison. And 3% of the total US population have served time in prison, yet 15% of the African American male population have served time in prison. And while 33% of the African American male population have a felony, only 8% of the overall population of males have a felony. Nearly 4 times. And in numerous states, there were at least 2.5% to 5% of the total adult African American population in prison. in 2010. At one time, and rates of incarceration have increased dramatically. In 1980, there were roughly 50,000 people incarcerated in this country. By 1997, that had skyrocketed to 400,000. And nearly 700,000 people are arrested for marijuana offenses each year. And almost 500,000 people still behind bars for nonviolent offenses. And maybe as you sit there contemplating how different life could be if you had only been born a different skin color. In the state of Florida, nearly 40% of Black men have a felony conviction, meaning 40% of the African American male population in Florida are unable to vote, at least until recently. And so you know the dangers for yourself and your kids. Maybe it's something that weighs on your mind. Maybe it's something that affects you so drastically, you even talk to your kids about it. And it's interesting that the talk can mean something different based on your race. For some, giving the talk to your kids means talking about the birds and the bees. But in the African American community, the talk means to discuss police and what to do if you're ever stopped by one. And in 2020, this led to the civil rights movement. If you're Black in this country, you're 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police. And maybe you sat in front of your TV or held your phone to your face as you watched George Floyd lie there on the ground, begging for his life. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he struggled to breathe until his body gave out. Not even screaming bystanders were enough to stop that. And you could feel that pain in the community. You could feel it because in many cases you have nearly been there. Maybe when you went to college, walking around the campus was a danger for you. And every week you would get stopped, asked by the cops what you're doing there, why are you walking around this place, and that there have been break-ins recently, insinuating that because you are walking around, maybe you are doing the break-ins. And you know this game well. You've played it for years. Walking around with a hoodie is a sure way to get yourself stopped. Sometimes you'll even laugh as you see a cop car drive by, knowing that they will circle right back around to stop you. Maybe you even see them from across the parking lot and know as you walk by that they're going to drive up and stop you. Or maybe even while walking around in a city you don't know very well. Police vehicles come from nowhere and stop you in the middle of the road, guns drawn, hands in the air. And you don't know at that moment if that will be your last breath. You don't know at that moment if you will never see your family again, if you will never see your kids again. And then what do you do when you need help? What happens when you're harassed? Do you call the police? Maybe you do once, not knowing where else to turn. And you call the police and they come to your house. Or maybe you call them to check on your neighbor, just to make sure they're okay. And in doing so, the police shoot them. Or maybe you approach a police vehicle to ask for help inside of a store. And as you approach the vehicle, they immediately draw their weapons. And so you give your kids the talk. And even more, the health disparities. A pandemic sweeps the country. Maybe you've been locked up for months at that point. But being a human, the urge to socialize is overwhelming. But you also know that you're 2 times more likely to die of COVID if you catch it. And even pregnancy is more dangerous. If you're a Black woman, you're 3 times more likely to die in childbirth. And while there are many different facets to these numbers, it might just come down to quality of life. Because you know your aunts and uncles that still live in a small backwoods town can't afford anything. They couldn't afford to go to the hospital. And so if they catch a deadly disease, they may just have to lie there in bed hoping to survive, hoping it's not the bad one. The average household income for a Black person is $40,000. While it's $68,000 for white folks. If you're Black, you're nearly 30% less likely to own a house. And even then, fighting for representation in your own country. Where you are still underrepresented, as only 3 Black senators serve today. Now, the culture is shifting. The civil rights movement brought a lot of things to light. And almost as one, we made our voices heard. We began to tell our stories. As many people thought this was all done and over with years ago, thought that because you are free from slavery, that you're free to move about this country as anyone else would. But you know you're not. You don't get to move through this world as easily. Even walking down the road, you've noticed people will cross the street just to avoid you. When you walk into a store, the store owner follows you. The fear of your skin is something that you may feel nearly every day. The fear of what you look like, how you talk, how you dress. And that's probably cultural. There hasn't been a lot of Black culture shown. We as a society rely on cultural movies, songs to tell us about people, to depict lives. The first show about Black people wasn't until 1970. And as of 2018, About 11% of all books are written by people of color. Black Panther in 2018 was celebrated as a novel accomplishment where directors, writers, and actors were predominantly Black, as one of the few times in history. So your fight is not done. Your kids, and perhaps even your kids' kids, are still at stake. Maybe you don't want them to live in this country, or maybe you don't want a friend's kids to live in this country like that. To always have to be two people. To focus on what other people are thinking about you so that you can be prepared for their reaction before you ever get to think about how you feel. And I'll end with this. A good story crosses the borders of our nations and our prejudices and our beliefs. A good story asks a question that can't be answered in simple terms. And even if we come up with some understanding years later while glancing out a window, the story still has potential to return, to alter right there in our mind and change everything. And so I hope these stories may have that impact on you. That maybe one day in the near future or far, as you look out a window, something will click. The aha moment. And the function of racism is a distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, so you spend 20 years proving that you do. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing. Toni Morrison. So now, go ahead and take a deep breath, taking in the air, filling it, holding it at the top as your lungs fill, and exhaling and letting all the tension out if there's any tension. Feeling the muscles grow soft again. And then take another deep breath. Fill the lungs, focusing on something relaxing, a sound, a sensation. And as you exhale, again, letting the muscles soften, beginning to feel the comfortableness return of being in your own bed or in your own chair. And when you are ready, you can open your eyes.